Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Global Market Access Trends webinar, brought to you by Informer's Datamonitor Healthcare. Today's presentation will be done by myself, Louisa Joseph, and my colleagues Astrid and Tiana Ignatovich. Just to note that everyone who's registered for this event will be sent the presentation and also the recording once the webinar is finished. Furthermore, if anyone has any questions, then you could submit these in the question box throughout the webinar, which can be found below the media player. So first of all today, we're going to look at an introduction to the global market access environment, and then we're going to take a deeper dive into the United States, the major European markets, the key emerging markets, followed by some key conclusions, and we'll leave some time at the end for some questions and answers. So first, an introductory to the global market access landscape. Payers across the US, Europe, and emerging markets are under an increasing amount of pressure to fund innovative medicines. New drugs are gaining approvals which significantly improve outcomes in indications with high levels of unmet need. Furthermore, with increasing attempts to speed up regulatory approvals, payers are under increased pressure to fund these therapies, which are often approved based on immature clinical trial data. Now, these demands, along with stretched healthcare budgets resulting from aging patient populations, changing demographics, and longer survival or treatment times, have increased the need for cost control mechanisms which limit the overall budget impact of these therapies but do not significantly hinder access. So let's look at some of the key dynamics shaping the market access landscape in the United States. Firstly, rising drug spend. Now, this is a trend which has been going on for a number of years and has resulted in significant public and government scrutiny over pharma's pricing strategies. Now, these two factors have heavily contributed to a growing demand for value-based pricing mechanisms to be introduced in the United States. And this is in an attempt to align what payers and also citizens are paying for drugs with the value that they provide. Taking a deeper dive into the issue of rising drug spend. Prescription drug expenditure has risen significantly over the past few decades and is demonstrated here by the CMS expenditure data shown in this graph. This increase does seem to have slowed down slightly over the past few years. However, it's still a huge worry for payers. Of course, some of this increase in spend can be attributed to increased utilization of therapies. However, there are a number of other contributing factors at play. Firstly, branded drug prices have nearly doubled since 2008, with manufacturing companies frequently hiking up list prices year on year in key therapeutic classes. Also, much of this increase in spend and utilization can be attributed to high-cost specialty drugs, and we frequently hear from payers that this is their number one worry. And finally, this isn't just an issue for payers. It's also negatively impacting patients, with beneficiaries' out-of-pocket costs often becoming unaffordable. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen in the news, there has been a huge increase in public and government scrutiny over drug prices over the past few years. President Donald Trump, who took office in January of 2017, has vowed to intervene and tackle rising drug spend. Now, one of the first things that was done was the publishing of a blueprint in May 2018, which, amongst other things, identified four main challenges in the US pharmaceutical market. These include high drug list prices, the lack of negotiating power for federal programs such as Medicare and Medicaid, the accusation that European governments are freeloading off US investment in pharmaceutical innovation, and finally, the high out-of-pocket costs for beneficiaries. So both as a result of this blueprint, but also off the back of other legislators' recognition that something really needs to be done about the issue of drug pricing in the United States, several reforms have been proposed over the past year. Now, this slide is more for your reference, and I'm not going to go into each one of these legislative reforms in detail. However, I do want to take a deeper dive into a couple of the reforms which have the potential to be the most impactful. And the first one we're going to look at today is the call for international price indexing. So international price indexing wants to peg Medicare Part B product prices, so the prices of hospital-administered products, against the prices paid in Europe. This reform has come off the back of statements from the Department of Health and Human Services and also the Council of Economic Advisors, who've accused European nations of freeloading off high US drug prices. And how does the Trump administration expect this to work? They want to reference the prices of Part B drugs to those paid in 14 other developed European nations. And the aim of this model is to reduce the average selling price of therapies by 30% in aggregate over 5 years. This reform was proposed in October of 2018. However, it's currently unknown whether or if this reform will actually be passed. So, as I said, this proposal or this reform has the potential to be one of the most impactful to date. However, many payers are actually skeptical that it will be passed, and this is because it's been met with significant criticism from numerous different stakeholders. So one of the first points of criticism is that this reform may actually jeopardize access to medicines in the United States and also discourage innovation in healthcare. Currently, patients in the US obtain the fastest and the widest access to healthcare in the world, and critics worry that if passed, this reform could reduce access in alignment with European counterparts. Furthermore, whilst this reform could, yes, result in manufacturing companies setting higher list prices in Europe, HTA and payer agencies are expected to simply react by negotiating higher rebates, and therefore the price overall, the impact on the price overall is expected to be nominal. Furthermore, the worst case scenario is that manufacturing companies actually abandon their efforts in European markets altogether, and this is an attempt to avoid reference pricing to lower income countries. The final point of criticism centers around the fact that this might be an overly simplistic way of introducing value-based pricing through the back door in the United States. Critics highlight that value-based pricing of pharmaceuticals should really be a highly nuanced and a multi-stakeholder process, which should reflect the willingness to pay, but also the budget constraints of the country in question. One interviewed payer said, "There is really very little said about actual value. It basically says, oh, we're just going to accept the evaluations that are created by other entities, whether they have a different set of values, whether it's a bigger or smaller problem in their country, and it doesn't really reflect what we're doing here in the United States." Now, the second potentially seminal reform we want to look at is the call to remove the ability of PBMs to negotiate rebates with manufacturers for Medicare Part D and Medicaid managed drugs. Now, there does seem to be true bipartisan support for increasing transparency within the rebate system in the United States. However, whether this is the best reform to take is currently unknown. So this reform aims to eliminate rebates altogether for federal programs. And this is for Medicare Part D and Medicaid managed drugs. So why has this proposal come about? The HHS wants to increase transparency in the supply chain and also encourage discounts to go directly to patients at the pharmacy counter. And how does the Trump administration expect this to work? So instead of negotiating rebates and discounts with manufacturing companies, pharmacy benefit managers would get a flat fee from manufacturing companies for including drugs on their plans. And this reform was proposed in February of 2019, but is yet to be passed. Now, as I mentioned, there really is true bipartisan support for increasing transparency within the pharmaceutical supply chain. However, whether this is the best route to take and what the long-term impact of this reform is very unclear. We expect that Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries with high drug costs will likely benefit from these reforms. However, insurance premiums for all beneficiaries are likely to increase as plans stop applying manufacturer rebates to reduce these payment obligations. Furthermore, it's currently very unclear whether manufacturing companies will actually lower drug list prices in accordance with the savings accrued from eliminating rebates. For example, in a recent Senate Finance Committee hearing, a number of top industry leaders stated that they would only be willing to lower drug list prices if rebates were also eliminated in the commercial market. Now, the final trend I want to look at is the growing demand for value-based pricing in the United States. Unlike in many European markets, there lacks a formal HTA or reimbursement body in the United States to assess the clinical value or the cost effectiveness of new drugs. Furthermore, payers highlight that they have very limited ability to negotiate prices for therapies in the United States, and this is especially for high-impact indications, such as in oncology, where there's often limited alternative treatment options. So these factors, along with a very fragmented healthcare system, have heavily contributed to soaring drug spending, and this in turn has increased the demand for manufacturing companies to justify their costs of their therapeutics based on the patient benefit that they provide. And this is the concept that we call value-based pricing. Now, the main way that manufacturing companies have engaged in value-based pricing so far has been through outcomes-based contracts. Outcomes-based contracts are based upon mutually agreed upon time measures or clinical performance scores. And if these outcomes or scores are not met, then manufacturing companies are either not reimbursed or are only partially reimbursed. And here we've highlighted a couple of high-impact examples of outcomes-based contracts negotiated in the United States. So, for example, with Novartis' chronic heart failure drug, Entresto, with Aetna, and also with Amgen's PCSK9 inhibitor, Repatha, with Harvard Pilgrim. So whilst we hear and see in news articles that there's an increased appetite for outcomes-based contracts in the United States, when we actually speak to payers, we're hearing a very different sentiment, and that is that payers are not yet convinced of their value. Many payers highlight that they view these deals as little more than a positive public relations exercise for pharma, and they really want to see evidence that these deals can create value savings that outweigh their administrative costs or savings that could be generated through simple rebate schemes. One interviewed payer said, "These outcomes-based contracts do not save money. It is really a pretense. If they think the drugs are overpriced, rather than create this crazy value-based pricing exercise to reduce the cost a little bit, just reduce the cost up front and save everybody all the work." Now, one exception to this rule does, however, seem to be for curative therapies, for example, with cell and gene therapies. And here, payers really see the value of outcomes-based contracts. This is likely due to the drug's high upfront costs, also because these therapies often launch with very immature efficacy and safety data, with the promise of significant efficacy accruing over the very long term. And also the fact that these drugs are often targeting relatively small patient populations, which make outcomes-based contracts much easier to implement and also administer. So the last trend I want to look at is the increasing influence of ICER in the United States. ICER it stands for the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, and it's a US-based and non-governmental agency which assesses the value that a new drug or medtech brings to patients and the healthcare system through calculating a value-based price benchmark. Now, unlike, say, NICE in the UK or CADIS in Canada, ICER has no such remit to directly influence pricing and reimbursement decisions, and it plays an advisory role only. However, it is the closest thing to an HTA agency in the United States, and payers would like to leverage the findings of these reports to manage pharmaceutical spend. However, they frequently highlight certain hurdles which are preventing widespread adoption, and these include lack of assessments for all drugs, delays in report publishing, methodology or transparency issues, and the fact that the agency is non-governmental and also non-regulated. So, based on these factors, few payer organizations formally utilize ICER reviews in their reimbursement process. Nonetheless, ICER does seem to have at least an indirect impact on pricing, as companies are increasingly seeking to avoid the negative publicity that they tend to get if their product is judged to be overpriced by ICER. Now, one interesting example that we've seen of a more formal utilization of these ICE reviews is with CVS Caremark. So CVS Caremark have excluded therapies from their self-insured plans with a price determined by ICER to be above $100,000 per quality. We expect the impact of this move to be significant, and this is considering the size of the pharmacy benefit manager and also its recent merger with Aetna. The move has been met with quite significant criticism, and this is mainly centered around the seemingly somewhat arbitrary nature of the $100,000 per quality threshold, with critics arguing that it really incentivizes manufacturing companies to launch drugs at the maximum cost-effective price, so the price that would get them just below the $100,000 per quality threshold, and they state that this really goes against the concept of value-based pricing. So I'm now going to move on to my colleague Astrid, who's going to take you through some of the key market access trends impacting the 5 major European markets.
Great. Thank you, Louisa. So, whereas in the U.S., payers are battling price hikes of existing medicines and that they need to contend with an environment without pricing controls, European payers are instead faced with the question of how do they afford newly launched medicines which hold clinical value. In Europe, we encounter a situation where regulators continue to rapidly approve these innovative medicines. And so the number of approved active new substances grew from 35 to 42 between 2017 and 2018. Additionally, a great proportion of these medicines are addressing areas of high unmet medical needs, which also then come in turn with a hefty price tag. Oncology as well as orphan drugs feature heavily in these recent approvals. Often, these high-priced medicines are launched with limited clinical data, which then again raises uncertainty with regards to whether or not these prices are commensurate to the benefit that they claim to bring about. Nevertheless, payers are empathetic to these situations and they do see the need to make these new treatments available. But again, there are clear and significant concerns about how an already stretched healthcare budget will be able to afford this impending growth. And so given the situation, EU payers are employing a multi-pronged approach to address these financial constraints. First, payers are controlling for volume of use by increasing the reach of the HTA, as well as creating an increasingly restrictive HTA environment, which ensures not only patients that benefit from the drug will be prescribed these innovative medicines. So this means payers are raising the bar for what constitutes a drug with significant clinical added benefit. Next, on the financial side, payers are also controlling for price. They're engaging in increasingly tough pricing negotiations. And new drugs are less likely to get pricing premiums upon launch. And also, in those markets where free pricing is allowed, well, there's increasing trends towards restricting that freedom as well. Finally, payers are also employing cost containment tools to ensure that the drugs they do have to fund do not cause additional significant constraints on an overstretched healthcare budget. So let's first take a look at the first type of strategy that payers use, and which is the evolution of HTA assessments and how that's changed in the 5 EU markets. So we have divided this into whether or not the reach, which are the number of drugs or the types of drugs being subject to HTA assessments have changed. Also, what processes are changing. And finally, what are the outcomes of these changes? We are going to look at a couple of representative countries and understand how the HTA decision processes there have evolved as a result of these financial constraints. Let's start with Italy. There are currently no major changes in terms of the reach of the HTA, but AIFA is employing a new innovation algorithm as a way to raise the bar for what constitutes these innovative drugs. So IEFA's new algorithm was put in place in 2017 to help determine the drugs that are offering novelty and therefore accelerate their access. And it takes account 3 criteria, which are the unmet therapeutic need, the drug's added therapeutic value, as well as the quality of evidence. And so based on these criteria, the drugs are then determined to be innovative, conditionally innovative, or not innovative. And getting innovation status will lead to economic advantages. So for example, for these innovative drugs, for 3 years, they are automatically included in regional formularies, and they're also reimbursed through a special fund. Additionally, they are also exempt from the payback scheme. And conditionally innovative drugs leads to immediate inclusion in the regional formularies for 18 months. Now, drugs that are not innovative, they unfortunately do not have any special perks. So what Datamonitor did was that we looked at the impact of IEFA's innovation algorithm on recently launched drugs. And so based on IEFA's early decisions, of the first 11 drugs assessed, 3 were considered innovative, as marked in the magenta boxes, and 1 was deemed conditionally innovative, which is in the colorless box, and the remaining in the dark purple boxes are considered non-innovative. And when we look into the patterns surrounding which criteria might be most important for IEFA, we see that in the highlighted box that all the drugs considered innovative had an added therapeutic value of importance, and this seems to be the crucial step to attaining that innovation designation. Next, let's move on to France. The overall HTA decisions there have remained the same, but the mechanics as well as the outcomes of these assessments have become increasingly restrictive. So as an overview, in France, drugs are reviewed for pricing and reimbursement after they have received marketing authorization. And then the Transparency Committee evaluates all new medicines and decides on the medical benefit rating, which is called the SMR, and the added medical benefit relative to appropriate comparators, called the ASMR, and then finally, the reimbursed patient population. Now, the SMR rating ranges from major to insufficient, and this impacts reimbursement, whereas the ASMR is a rating from 1 to 5, with 1 being major and 5 as having no added benefit to the comparator, and this largely impacts pricing. So what do we see in France? Well, what we see is that attaining an ASMR of 3 or better is becoming increasingly harder. In 2017, of the 53 new medicines assessed, only 13 received any therapeutic improvement rating. Of those, 11 received a minor ASMR of 4, and 2 received a moderate ASMR of 3. There were no medicines that had an ASMR of 1 or 2. And so what's the significance of this? Well, as you will recall, ASMR impacts pricing, and so they really determine whether or not a drug will get a pricing premium or if it will have to be discounted to attain access. And so it's especially advantageous for drugs to get an ASMR of 1 to 3, because then the manufacturers there can notify a price rather than negotiating for a price. And then the price authorized in France will not drop below the lowest price in the 4 other 5 EU markets in the 5 years following initial approval for reimbursement. Now, unfortunately, on the other hand, drugs with minor benefit are not faring as well. They traditionally could expect a modest price premium over the existing standard of care, but that's no longer the case, as the new directive ensures drugs that launch with an ASMR of 4 will not trigger increases in health system costs. And so what's the impact of this? Well, some medicines with an ASMR of 4 rating and a generic comparator have faced more stringent pricing negotiations and delays in writing upon a price. And so one notable example we saw was with Novartis's heart failure drug Entresto, which was approved with a generic comparator. And this was approved in 2015, and the final price agreement happened in October 2018, 3 years after the approval. And so again, while we see the ASMR impacting pricing, we are also seeing changes in the sense that ASMR is now also impacting reimbursement. And so these ASMR changes that are impacting reimbursement are affecting the accessibility of hospital drugs. And so normally, these drugs are funded through diagnosis-related group payments. But the expensive inpatient drugs, which are not traditionally covered by DRG funding, have been put on a list called the list en sus, which is then reimbursed outside of the hospital budget by the French National Health Insurance Fund. What we're seeing, however, is that spending on the list en sus has risen dramatically since 2010. And in 2016, in a move designed to save 205 million euros annually, regulators there have changed how the drugs are now added onto the list. So under the new rules, all products must have an SMR of major or important to qualify. But now ASMR scores are also coming into play. So drugs with an ASMR of 1 to 3 will be included on the list regardless of the comparator. However, drugs with an ASMR of 4 or 5 may attain a listing only if the comparator is included inside the list. There is one exception. A drug with an ASMR of 4 that does not have a comparator on the list can be listed if they provide a significant public health interest. So what's happening in terms of the changes? Well, these changes on the list en sus have significantly impacted many drugs, including cancer drugs. And it does do so for both the products that are on the market as well as those that are about to launch. And so what we've seen is that we've seen delistings occurring for Pfizer's leukemia drug Zayvados, as well as United Therapeutics' pulmonary arterial hypertension drug Remodulin. We've also seen hospital funding for several cancer drugs that were withdrawn on a per indication basis for Roche's Avastin and Herceptin, as well as Janssen's Velcade and Salix. And then for new drugs, novel drugs for multiple myeloma have been experiencing access delays as well. For example, Kyprolis was added onto the list en sus only when it submitted additional data, which then moved the drug from an ASMR of 4 to 3 during reassessment. And again, this also took 2.5 years after its approval. So what we're seeing here is that ASMR of 4 does not necessarily guarantee access onto that list en sus. And so as one French payer commented, if you get an ASMR of 4, you could be reimbursed on paper, but you would have no access because the recommendations would not be followed on top of the DRG. Now, these rule changes have been particularly negative development in terms of the accessibility for infused oncology drugs in France. However, French payers are making exceptions for immunotherapies, and again, this may signal some future changes to the list en sus process. Now, unfortunately, France is not the only place where pricing has been an issue. We are also seeing Germany, which is also dealing with the managing of pricing of expensive drugs. And payers there are unhappy with the free pricing period for all manufacturers and are particularly concerned with the orphan drug loophole. So let's take a step back here and take a look at what the Germany HTA AMNOG process looks like. So in Germany, all new drugs launching in an indication are assessed and priced relative to existing treatments via the AMNOG process. So when a drug launches, the manufacturer unilaterally sets the new drug's price at the time of launch, and the drug is reimbursed fully at that price for the drug's first year. At the same time, the manufacturers also submit their dossier for evaluation by the Federal Joint Committee, otherwise known as the GBA. Now, in the first 6 months after launch, the GBA assesses clinical safety and efficacy, and then they will make a determination on the added benefit of the drug compared to a comparator that they've chosen. At the end of those 6 months, the GBA makes a final decision on whether or not the new drug has added benefit. So for those that have an added benefit, their price will be negotiated upwards from the comparator's price. However, without an added benefit, the price during negotiation cannot be any higher than the comparator. Now, during the next 6 months, manufacturers go through negotiation with the GKV to get to a price for year 2. And so if during the months 6 to 12 they do reach an agreement, then the price starts at the beginning of year 2. Now, if they don't reach an agreement, the drug price is then determined through arbitration. And if it reaches an agreement at arbitration, the price will then be applied retrospectively from the beginning of year 2. If, however, there is no agreement during arbitration, then the manufacturer will withdraw the drug from the market. So while I've described this AMNOG process, and it is standard for all drugs, the orphan drugs themselves receive special treatment. And so payers there are particularly unhappy with the obligation to fund the provision for costly orphan drugs with weak data after 12 months following the launch. And so again, just to jot your memory, recall first that in Germany, free pricing still holds for the first 12 months, where manufacturers sets the price regardless of that orphan status. Where we run into the issue is when we set that pricing for year 2. And again, this is because orphans benefit from the so-called orphan drug loophole. At launch, they are mandated by law to have an automatic added benefit. And so if you will recall, this means that pricing for the second year can be higher than that HTA comparator. And so, when the GKV is doing that pricing negotiation in the first year to set the price for year 2, the manufacturer has an easier time to negotiate a higher price because of the drug's automatic added benefit, despite perhaps not having conclusive data to prove that significant benefit. And so only when the orphan drugs exceed 50 million euro in annual spending do they then undergo a true AMNOG assessment where the drug needs to provide evidence of efficacy over the HTA comparator to maintain the added benefit rating and maintain that good price. Now, what happens to the drugs that never exceed the 50 million euro annual spend? Well, they have the advantage of maintaining the good price without having to go through that AMNOG assessment. And so what payers want to see is this closure of the special treatment for orphan drugs altogether so that there is no automatic added benefit upon launch. And so as one German payer said, the next loophole that gets closed is the orphan drug loophole. I'm not sure whether it's in 2 years or in 4 years, but that will certainly happen. And unfortunately, the budget pressure in Europe is not limited to the niche orphan patient population where they do have clinically effective drugs and a high price tag, and that they address an unmet need. Payers, however, now are facing greater pressure to fund innovative drugs, but they have the added feature of the moderate to high prevalence indications, as well as an expected high demand. And so payers there have little choice but to find ways to fund and afford these medicines. And European payers themselves have personally experienced this upon the launch of the hepatitis C drugs, which created multiple funding crises in multiple EU markets. Other drugs, such as the immune checkpoint inhibitors, as well as the oncology combination products, are also expected to exert similar pressures. And so to address these issues, payers have payment tools to help them mitigate the effect of funding for these drugs. So some examples for some of these new cost containment tools are budget ceiling agreements, which have now been agreed for immunotherapies in France. Additionally, Italian payers are also foregoing the more complex risk-sharing deals in favor of price-volume agreements. Additionally, payers are also resorting to thresholds, and as we will see in the UK, payers there have implemented the budget impact test. So let's take a look at a cost containment tool in greater detail. Well, the UK has introduced a 20 million budget impact test for all newly launched drugs. And so what we see here is that normally in the UK, under routine commissioning, the NHS is required to make new drugs available within 90 days of a positive NICE final HTA recommendation. But as of 2017, drugs that are recommended by NICE, but that's forecast to increase a net NHS spending by more than £20 million in any of the first 3 years, will need to go through an additional price negotiation before routine commissioning. So now, if in this next step you do get a price agreement, then commissioning will occur as usual. If, however, the agreement is not reached, the NHS England could request a variation to the statutory funding requirement. And what this means is that it's likely to involve the phased introduction of funding for a drug, and thereby limiting its availability for up to 3 years in a bid to mitigate the impact on NHS finances. So far, what we've seen is that Merck's drug Keytruda is the only drug that has gone through the full budget impact test, and it did so for its first-line PD-L1 positive non-small cell lung cancer indication. Now, we speculate that it's highly likely that Merck had to agree to a substantial price concession in order to get Keytruda launched under routine commissioning. And so what have we learned here in terms of the European as well as the NHS England lessons? Well, as one NHS England payer has said, I think the lessons that I would give would be to do not forget the I in the middle of that budget impact test. I stands for impact. And so it's not about how much your drug is going to cost. It is the extra cost of your drug's effect on the pathway, and to be brutally realistic about what that is. And so now that we've seen the myriad of ways in which European payers have tried to address financial constraints of new and expensive medicines, let's hear from Tiana for a look at market access in the key emerging markets.
Thank you, Astrid. So what are the key forces shaping access in emerging markets? Well, as opposed to developed markets where national healthcare systems or health insurance programs are very well established and account for the majority of drug sales, emerging markets have historically been predominantly self-pay markets, so driven by out-of-pocket costs, where growth depended on expanding middle classes. However, as emerging markets economies have been growing over the past 2 decades, so has the patient demand for access to healthcare and innovative treatments. And as a result of that pressure, many governments have embarked on a period of expansion of public healthcare programs for their populations. Whereas initially those programs focused on providing access to basic services, now there is an increasing number of cases where we have seen the inclusion of innovative medicines in some of the subsidized medicine programs. However, it is important to note that the rollout of those drug coverage initiatives in many emerging markets was announced or embarked upon during periods of quite strong economic growth. And what we're seeing now is that with many of the emerging market economies slowing down, funding issues have begun to delay the rollout of planned reimbursement initiatives or pose the threat to the really long-term viability of existing schemes. Also, efforts to limit costs that are associated with expanding access to medicines are being stepped up, and what this really means is greater pricing pressures and prescribing controls. And even in those situations where reimbursement is available on paper, in reality, inadequate funding can and does limit prescribing and therefore patient access. So let's now first look at some of the examples of recent expansions of public reimbursement programs. So as I have mentioned, the number of innovative patented medicines that are contained included on major public formularies has increased appreciably in some emerging markets over the past 5 years or so, and China has been leading the way. So in July 2017, 36 new drugs were added to the List B of the National Reimbursement Drug List, including more than 20 multinational patented brands, and more than half of the 36 products were oncology or immune modulating medicines. However, these listings were granted in return for price cuts averaging 44%, although for some drugs, discounts went up to 70%. 2018 saw 15 more oncology multinational brands added to the National Reimbursement Drug List. And in this case, average price reductions were 57%, so higher. And apart from these wider access, there are also signs that access is speeding up. So these latest listings include several drugs that were granted approval since the beginning of 2017. And for one, Novartis' lung cancer treatment Zycavia, listing was achieved less than 6 months after approval. Announcements made only last month by the National Healthcare Security Administration that it plans to expand reimbursement by the end of this year to include further cancer drugs, as well as some orphan drugs, as also treatments for chronic diseases, indicates that the access conditions will continue to be favorable. But still, the key takeaway here is that the price negotiations were critical in enabling these new listings. And that means that the willingness to compromise on price is critical to achieve access. And what's been happening in some other markets? Well, Russia has also seen some, though more limited, expansion of public health sector formularies. So in 2018, around 35 products were added to the vital and essential drug list, which governs reimbursement for outpatient drugs for vulnerable patient groups. Also, 3 patented brands were added to the list of high-cost medicines that are used in the treatment of 7 serious diseases, which this is the so-called 7 nosologies program or the VZN program. And these drugs included Pfizer's hemophilia treatment Benefix, Sanofi Genzyme's Gaucher disease drug Serdagla, as well as their multiple sclerosis treatment Aubagio. A further expansion of this VZN 7 nosologies program to cover further 3 indications was also confirmed by President Putin in the run-up to the 2018 elections. However, given the current economic troubles that the country is facing, I think this past pre-election largesse is really unlikely to be repeated in the near future. There are also some further clouds on the horizon in Russia, and that really includes the lack of any progress on the rollout of the planned national outpatient reimbursement program. This plan was announced during the first half of this decade, but again, due to the economic crisis the country has been experiencing, these plans have not been realized yet. So clearly there are some positive developments, but despite these positive developments, it is important to note that gaining access to public sector formularies poses a difficult and often complex challenge for the originators. And this is due to a number of factors. So firstly, the national formularies are typically restrictive, with many based largely on the WHO's model list of essential medicines, and often they're subject to delayed updates. Secondly, comprehensive access to public sector formularies may be complicated by the multi-layered nature of a responsibility for the medicine's provision. So, for example, in Mexico, manufacturers need to negotiate it separately with 3 different major public sector payers, each of which operates their own formulary. Thirdly, the scarcity of funds that's available to underpin these subsidized medicine programs often can prevent scripts to be filled, even if there is listing on paper. Sometimes the coverage is partial, it does not cover the full cost of the drug, and this poses affordability issues for many patients. So as a result of these challenges, patients in some countries have actually turned to the courts to get access to the medicines they need. And this is in particular the case in several Latin American countries, such as Brazil, where universal right to healthcare is enshrined in their constitution. Over the past few years, these legal challenges have actually had a very high success rate. And this has begun to put a strain not only on the legal system, but also on the public healthcare finances. So in response, the policymakers have now begun to push back. So what we've seen in Brazil is that the Supreme Court has raised the bar for lawsuits seeking access to medicines, and they're now making it more difficult for the physicians and patients to justify their case, therefore narrowing down this access route. And looking overall, this restrictive nature of public sector reimbursement really means that private formularies have traditionally been the main initial target for originators seeking access in emerging markets. However, this is not without challenges. The private insurance market in many of the emerging market economies is limited in terms of sophistication as well as size, and often it really only gives limited drug reimbursement outside the inpatient treatment. Instead, inclusion on high-end private hospital formularies is the main early goal of originators that are seeking market access for new drugs. Although these private hospital formularies tend to vary dramatically both between and within individual markets, which of course further complicates things. So now let's look at another key trend, which is relating to the growing pricing pressures that we've been observing. So traditionally, owing to the self-pay nature of most emerging markets, the majority of the new drug prices have been free from any explicit regulatory control. But that is changing because as access to medicines through public reimbursement programs has been increasing, so have the reach and the depth of pricing controls. There are already several established tools used by emerging market payers to control and put pressure on drug prices. The first one is external reference pricing. This method is widely employed by many emerging market countries, but the size and the nature of the reference country basket does vary. In most cases, price is set at the lowest price prevailing in any of the reference countries. The second tool is the use of government-linked procurement agencies or hospital purchasing systems. These systems tend to be an established feature of several emerging Asian and South American markets, and this really gives the payers another means of ramping up pressures on prices. But there are now also several new tools that are used by countries where governments are attempting to provide subsidized access to more new drugs. The first one is the use of managed entry agreements, and the second one, the broader use of health technology assessments. And we will now look into these two in more detail. So, firstly, let's look at the use of health technology assessments in emerging markets. So while the cost is still really the main factor that's informing reimbursement coverage decisions, governments in a growing number of developing economies have expressed a desire to broaden the basis on which such decisions are reached. And as a result, we've seen several markets that have instituted formal HTA processes. And some of these countries actually use pharmacoeconomic analysis. So we can see that in Brazil, their agency, CONITEC, plays a major role in the decisions on inclusion of new medicines to the national reimbursement programs, and they make these decisions based on cost-effectiveness assessments. Whereas the Center for Drug Evaluation is a key stakeholder in Taiwan, and HITAP has been in place for a decade in Thailand. However, what we've seen is that development of explicit HTA systems really remains at an early stage in most emerging markets. And any moves towards more widespread adoption of this approach will in reality be hindered, at least in some countries, by shortages of both technical expertise as well as the local data. Nevertheless, this move towards a wider use of HTA in emerging markets does pose a big challenge for the manufacturers, and this is especially true in countries where GDP per capita is limited, and particularly if agencies in those countries set explicit cost-effectiveness thresholds, which do tend to be low. So, for example, in Thailand, an explicit quality-adjusted quality-based threshold has been applied since 2018. Now, even though this threshold has been raised over time, so from an initial figure of 100,000 to a current figure of 160,000 Thai baht per quali, that figure is still equivalent to less than £4,000. And if you compare that to the UK's NICE upper threshold of £30,000, this is almost 8 times lower. So overall, what this really means is that where HTA is employed, new drug pricing will be exposed to additional pressures. Another recent trend in the emerging markets is the growing use, or at least openness to engaging in managed entry agreements, which we have seen both on the side of emerging market payers as well as the manufacturers operating in these markets. And in fact, we could even see these kind of approaches as one of the key strategies to overcoming the current access challenges in these geographies. So, for example, in China, the recent National Reimbursement Drug List updates were the result of confidential discounts that were struck with manufacturers. And interestingly, in 2019, Pfizer actually launched a new risk-sharing program for its breast cancer drug Ibrance. And under this program, it will reimburse up to a third of the cost of the drug for patients whose disease progresses within 4 months, which, as opposed to the other straight discounts that we have seen, actually has an outcomes component. In Brazil and Turkey, these first managed entry agreements that were struck were for the new generation hepatitis C drugs, Gilead, Sovaldi and Harvoni, and AbbVie's Viekirax. And in this instance, they include price volume agreements in Turkey, whereas in Brazil, manufacturers are only paid for cured patients. The Brazilian Ministry of Health also recently indicated they're looking towards risk-sharing for reimbursement of Spinraza, which may open up the door for the outcomes-based deal, at least for orphan drugs. Developments in Mexico are in much earlier stages, mostly involving some positive statements around future agreements. So this is really a country where we want to keep an eye on for future developments. Still, it is worth noting that most deals that were struck to date are simple financial agreements, as really the infrastructure for more sophisticated outcomes-based deals is lacking. Nevertheless, these recent examples indicate where there is a willingness to compromise on price or to engage in a flexible and tailored way, access can be achieved. So now that we have looked in some more detail at market access trends in the US, Europe, as well as emerging markets, let's summarize some key conclusions and takeaways. So, in summary, in response to the funding pressures and growing access demands they have been experiencing over the past few years, payers around the globe are responding in multiple ways. Firstly, they are ramping up the pricing pressures. So, in the US, that means that legislators are discussing the option to introduce pricing controls for the first time, whereas in Europe, payers are increasingly taking a tough stance on pricing negotiations, and emerging market payers expanding the scope of their drug pricing controls. Secondly, more countries are resorting to using health technology assessments as a means of aligning the prices of medicines with the value that they bring. So in the US and emerging markets, that may mean instituting the use of HTA for the first time, whereas in Europe, payers are tightening their existing assessment criteria or extending the reach of HTA. And finally, achieving reimbursement is also getting tougher, with payers denying access in competitive drug classes or imposing access restrictions that can then impact drug uptake. So, what should drug developers do in response to these changes in the market access landscape? Firstly, given the level of the drug prices scrutiny, especially in the US, it is important to ensure a high level of transparency within the pharmaceutical pricing process. This will also involve working with the legislators on any potential changes to the current pricing freedom. Secondly, it is critical to engage with HTA bodies and payers early on to gain understanding of the market access environment for drugs so that a cost-effective pricing strategy can be made and also realistic uptake expectations can be formulated. Any such HTA and payer engagement at any stage really also needs to ensure that manufacturers will understand and, importantly, fully acknowledge what the payer value perceptions are, as well as their changing evidentiary needs, to prevent any stumbling blocks further down the line. And it's also critical to keep in mind that discussions will not be just about the price of a single drug, but that payers are increasingly considering the impact of a new drug launch on the cost of a whole treatment pathway and the healthcare system as a whole. And this is particularly relevant to some of the oncology drugs that are now developed for much earlier line of treatment, and they can result in longer survival and treatment times. Manufacturers also need to be prepared to be flexible and to tailor their market access strategies to local market needs, as we are now seeing an increasing number of instances where such approaches are paying off in emerging markets. And finally, given that the market access landscape is in a state of flux as payers grapple with the funding pressures they're facing, pharma companies need to keep abreast of any policy changes, especially as payers look for new ways to mitigate the budget impact of costly new drugs. Thank you for listening. As a reminder, a copy and the recording of the presentation will be available for all those who registered for this event. We have only managed to talk through some of the key highlights in terms of the developments in the covered markets, and I would like to direct you to the additional resource to the white paper we have published, as well as the Datamonitor Healthcare reports that dive in much more further detail on the topics that we've covered across the key geographies and the diseases. So we will now have a few minutes to take your questions. You can submit your questions in the box below the media player. And we will now have a look at some of the questions that you have submitted. So let me choose, let me see which one. Okay, so let's look at this one first. It's about the US. So you mentioned that ICER has an indirect influence on pharma pricing. Are there any specific examples of this? Louisa, you've covered the US. Can you please address this one?
Sure. So what I meant by indirect influence is that manufacturing companies have very much recognized that they gain negative press and also pushback from payers when their therapy is determined to be overpriced by ICER. So they want to work with the agency in order to develop a cost-effective pricing strategy and gain ease of market access. ICER have said that a number of manufacturing companies have reached out with the intention to work collaboratively with them. However, so far we've only seen specific examples with Regeneron and Sanofi. So Regeneron and Sanofi worked with the agency post-launch of their PCSK9 inhibitor Praluent, and they agreed to lower the cost of Praluent in line with the range that ICER said was cost-effective. And this was in exchange for the removal of quite significant payer reimbursement restrictions. The agency also worked with Sanofi and Regeneron for their atopic dermatitis drug called Dupixent, and they worked with the company with that, but pre-launch, and this was to develop a cost-effective pricing strategy for the novel biologic.
Thank you, Louisa. There's another one that's asking about events in Europe. Can you give us some further details as to what happened with the checkpoint inhibitor reimbursement in France? Astrid, you have touched upon this. Can you answer this one, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tiana. So what happened with is that they ended up gaining access onto the list on SUS, even though they had an ASMR 4 in their first assessment, so against the generic comparators. And that's only, again, in some of the indications as well as the certain lines of therapies. And this is kind of an exception because as you'll recall from the ASMR 4, you have two options of getting onto the list on SUS, right? So if the comparator is either already on the list, or if that comparator is not on the list, then the drug has to be an interest for public health. But payers did make that exception, and that's because they were more lenient because the drugs themselves had shown significant promise, but that the data that they had at launch wasn't mature enough to assess that full long-term survival benefit. And the reason for this is that they don't necessarily have this data because they are going for earlier lines of therapy. So having data at launch, such as gold standard endpoints for median overall survival, is really difficult since the patients are living longer. And the second part of it is the fact that the payers also made this exception based on what I would call the market implications, right? The potential negative pushback for what it means if immunotherapies aren't fully accessible in France, especially when that means that France may be one of the only countries in Europe to deny access to this potentially life-saving medicine. And so what I think is really interesting is whether or not the exceptions that they've made here for immunotherapies will actually serve as a catalyst, right, to other changes in the future, especially as we do have more oncology drugs that are targeting these earlier lines. And so therefore you'll have situations where you have even more longer survival times. What I see here is that the landscape is changing quite a bit in France, and we have the story with immunotherapies, and there's also potential change for the ASMR and SMR rating system to change to a single measure. And so these are all the various policy areas that we'll be keeping a very close eye on in the coming year.
Thank you, Astrid. I think this is all the time we have for the questions today, but we will get back to you all individually on the questions we have not managed to answer, and you can submit further questions to the email address pharma@informa.com. Thank you again for joining this webinar, and have a nice rest of your day.